Hello, welcome, and thanks for joining me for another book chat. Today, let's spend a few minutes with Lost Knowledge of the Imagination by Gary Lachman. This book was originally published back in 2017 by Floris Books of the UK. I decided to pick it up. I heard about this author. I think it was on a podcast, and I went and checked out the author, and he's written several books along these similar lines. And, a book with the title like Lost Knowledge of, or Secret History of, or Hidden Knowledge of, always grabbed my attention. And so this one, I decided to just go ahead and pick it up and give it a read, and I'm really glad I did. It was really interesting. It's a work of nonfiction. I thought what I would do is just run through the chapters and sort of give a description of each of the chapters, and that way it would sort of describe what's covered in the book. There are 6 chapters in total. So yeah, chapter 1 is called A Different Way of Knowing. And in this chapter, the author talks about the different ways that, humanity's had of understanding the world around them. One thing that's discussed in this chapter is the Axial Age by Carl Jaspers. And the Axial Age is this age when, I think it covers up to from about the 8th century till about the 3rd century BC. And during this era is when the author argues humanity's sort of spiritual life and intellectual life got framed, that we still are working under this framework from the Axial Age. For example, this was the era of Socrates and Buddha, among others. He talks about that. And also he talks about the Enlightenment, when humanity's way of understanding shifted again during the Enlightenment to sort of the scientific rationality that we're living under even, still today to a large degree. So yeah, this A Different Way of Knowing. This is chapter 1. Chapter 2 is called A Look Inside the World. And here he talks about inside us versus outside us, and how we perceive ourselves as being separate, from the world, and how we're really, not necessarily separate from the world, but we think we are. So we have this idea of us as there's an inside us, and then there's everything else around us. And, we humans haven't always had this view of the world as us and the world as separate things, but this is how we sort of experience the world now. I thought of this chapter, when I was reading this chapter, I thought about a fish. So, you talk about a fish that lives in the ocean, and you think of that fish that they live in this ocean world, and they're completely enveloped by the ocean world. But if a fish saw us, they would think the same thing as us. We see a fish and we say, they're wet, and a fish would say us and say they're dry, but we're actually completely enveloped in our world meaning, the oxygen and everything around us. We're not really separate from that. We are commingled with it all the time. And so, I sort of thought of that analogy to sort of help me understand this idea of inside us versus outside us. And then chapter 3 is called The Knower and the Known. And this chapter talks about Goethe a lot, and how humanities, as after the Enlightenment in the 19th century, Goethe sort of through this story, Werther, sort of ushered in the Romantic era, where our perception, our humanity's perception, at least the European perception, shifted again to this sort of romantic version, a romantic worldview that sort of tempered and changed the Enlightenment worldview. And there's a section of this chapter about Goethe's exploration as a naturalist and his sort of search for the primal plant. And I have to admit, I don't really totally understand what Goethe or this book was talking about when it was the primal plant, but it's basically the ultimate plant. It's the plant that created all other plants. And it's sort of got a mystical connotation to me, or at least that's how it was presented in this book. So I don't totally get the primal plant. I've actually kind of just done quick searches and see if I could understand a little bit more about Goethe's The Primal Plant, and I'm afraid I still don't get the primal plant totally, but this chapter concerns that, among other things. But yeah. Chapter 4 is called The Way Within. Jung's experience, Jung's experience, this way within. So it talks about Jung's experience, Carl Jung, the psychologist from the earlier 20th century, and his experience having these sort of precognitive dreams where he had, I guess, a precognition at one point when he was on a train of World War One, which he later interpreted it this way when World War One wound up happening. He interpreted that experience as being sort of a precognition of World War One. And then he also, in this chapter, talks about, along the lines of Jung's still, synchronicities and Jung's idea of a cosmic consciousness and how synchronicities happen, where synchronicity is when you come across something, maybe you're thinking of something or something has a meaning to you and you come across it at a certain time. It seems to be a random event, but yet it has some kind of meaning and you understand it to have some sort of deeper meaning. This is a synchronicity. He also talks about in this chapter Jung's sort of spirit guide that he had. I did not know this because I don't know a lot about Carl Jung actually, but apparently he had this sort of, I guess, I don't want to call it a spirit guide, but he had this this being, or maybe this thing that he called Philemon. And it was sort of like a mentor, but it was like in a spirit sort of realm that he communicated with this Philemon. Again, I didn't know a lot about that, but I thought the chapter was actually fairly interesting about that, so it was kind of cool to learn about that a little bit. And I think the point of this chapter was how, our imagination with the cosmic consciousness, how we really share more than we know with people around us, according to the author. Again, through the imagination. This book is about our imagination. So imagination as opposed, I'll talk a little bit more about the difference between imagination in the sense of just fantasizing versus the imagination that they're talking about here. But so chapter 5, The Learning of the Imagination, talks about the art of the 20th century as struggling for these universal symbols that our minds actually, our consciousness operates on with symbols. It operates symbolically, and so the art a lot of times is how we see art, symbolically. So we interpret art this way, and so he argues of this chapter is concerning like the art of the 20th century and how that was reflecting our consciousness of the time, how our consciousness was shifting in the 20th century, and how old sort of symbolic forms were decaying and had sort of lost their power, and then so they were sort of in decline, and then reducing, breaking apart, and then new symbols, struggling to replace those. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And then chapter 6 is called The Responsible Imagination. And this is all about how imagination influences the world, actually creates the world, the author argues. And there is a quote from Einstein that I thought I would read here. The journalist George Viereck was asked Einstein if he trusted his imagination more than his knowledge, and Einstein, according to this book, replied, "Imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited. Imagination encircles the world." So, this chapter is about how our imagination impacts on the world. There's another quote from the book that I thought I would read that sort of explains it. About the previous, like everything that we've covered in the book so far. He says, "Each of these thinkers, and there are many others like them, believe that in a very real sense, our imagination, our consciousness is in some way creative, not only in art, poetry, music, but in reality itself. In some sense, for them, we do indeed create reality, or at least are an essential agent in its coming into being. Imagination, then, is not about make-believe, but about make-real." So, the whole sort of gist of the book, I think, what I took away from the book was that our imagination is part of our consciousness. Our imagination is our consciousness symbolically interpreting the world, making sense of the world, and then also creating our own reality. So, it's kind of mystical, right? And also a little confusing. I didn't follow everything that I read in the book, but, it's really kind of interesting to think of it this way, how our consciousness not only does this for us, but as we connect, our consciousness, our imaginations are connected with others, and so through this sort of creative power of the imagination, we make our reality, we make our world in a very real sense. So yeah. So takeaways from the book, that's a very powerful thing to me, and very interesting thing. I think I was recently watching Picard, the TV series, the new Star Trek TV series, and in the final episode, not to give any spoilers away, but in the final episode, there is a device called an imagination something, and it has something about imagination, and it is this sort of device where this is what, by using the person's imagination, then something real happens through this device. And so to me, this is kind of like what this book was trying to say, like that we have this in us. It's an innate part of being human that we might not recognize consciously, but it's nevertheless there. So anyway, so glad I read the book. He's written some other sort of books along these lines, a little bit mystical, but really kind of interesting. So I may pick up a few more in the future and give them a read. And if so, of course, I will chat them. So speaking of chats, my next chat is going to be on this book, The Letters of Peter Abelard, The Letters of Abelard and Heloise. These are the letters of Peter Abelard and Heloise. If you've heard of them, if not, stay tuned for the next chat, and we will go over these letters written about 900 years ago to these two lovers. So stay tuned for that. Until next time, take care. Bye.